When I first saw the pricing for this 26-liter case, I thought, oh, I guess that's nice. It's probably going to be really cheap, right? But hey, I was wrong. It's actually really, really nice. Welcome to Machines and More. Today the Lian Li Dan A3-mATX is launching. This is the second brainchild from the Lian Li and Dan collaboration after the A4H2O, which is still one of my favorite SFF cases to date. So today I'll cover the features of the case, we'll walk through the build process, we'll talk thermals, and I'll share why I think this case is going to be the go-to compact MATX case going forward. Before we begin, full transparency, this case was provided by Lian Li for the purposes of evaluation and making this review at no cost to the channel, but I am not paid by them for this review, nor do they have any input into how I test, and they are not made aware of any of the review findings until you are. And if you enjoy this type of content, please go ahead and give a like and make sure you are subscribed because it really helps the channel out, and big thanks in advance. So when you think about Dan cases, your mind probably turns to SFF cases. Like the A4 SFX, that case's footprint is to a sheet of A4 paper to what this guy, the A3's footprint is to an A3 sheet of paper. It's a bit longer at 443 millimeters long by 194 millimeters wide by 306 millimeters tall, excluding the roughly 15 millimeter tall feet, making this one around about 26 liters, which is fairly compact in MATX space. It feels kind of just like a longer NR200 since it's actually just a tad taller otherwise. As its name suggests, it is designed around the MATX motherboard form factor, and it supports ATX power supplies, and despite these more compact and smaller dimensions, it surprisingly has a ton of compatibility built in. So one thing to note is that the sample I have here, it's not the retail version, so I didn't get it in the retail packaging, so I'm not 100% sure at this point how it will be packed and how it will look for consumers. For example, there's supposed to be branding that identifies this as a Lian Li product, and that will go at the back, like the A4H2O, but mine doesn't have it. So just be aware there may be some small variations you'll see in this video. This case is steel with a plastic front panel. The side and top cover and the front panels, they're all toolless, except for the top panel. They latch into clips like here. The top actually slides into keyhole slots and secures with 2 thumb screws at the rear. Top is a cover, and removing it doesn't allow the case to be completely open. The rad mounting section is riveted into place there. Front panel I/O is on the bottom of the front panel. The bottom is riveted in also, and it's integrated into the main structure. The legs, they're just straight bars like the A4H2O, and it features a magnetic dust filter here at the bottom. Side panels are ventilated with 1.5 millimeter round holes. There is a glass side panel option that's available separately. I will test that too. The power supply cage comes with an ATX to SFX bracket, which is removable, and that can mount to the front here, or it can mount directly next to the motherboard. And these two positions have a series of slots where the user can alter the height where it hangs, and that will determine how much space you have for your cooling and for your graphics card. So let me just cover a few highlights since there are way too many combinations. They had a chart with like 30 rows on it, and that's just too many for the scope of a video here, but we'll cover what is most important, then I'll summarize it. So when an ATX power supply is in the highest position, that's going to be close to the top here, that's going to give you the most GPU clearance because essentially it's unimpeded. You're basically high enough that the card goes all the way to the front panel, and that's 415 millimeters long. When your power supply is at the top though, you can still have 3 by 120 millimeter fans, but because it's so high, that eliminates the possibility of having a 360 rad up top. But although they're officially not saying it can, there is still, from what I can tell, plenty of room for a 240 millimeter unit. Probably not a 280 since there's only 300 millimeters here. If you shift the power supply down one notch to where the cables would be what interferes with the card, The official spec there is 344 millimeters, so it's still good enough for an MSI Supreme 4090, and depending on how thick your rad and fan combo is, you may have enough room at the top for the 360, but it isn't until you shift the power supply down to the third position that Lian Li indicates support for a 360 millimeter rad and fans. At that point, your ATX power supply itself is going to get into the way of the card, and there you're going to have 334 millimeters. Still, it's not too bad. Just to give you an idea for my test build here, I have the power supply in position 4, and I am able to clear the thicker rad and fan combo for my AIO, which is 60 millimeters. You can also mount the power supply next to the motherboard, but that unless you keep this at the very top, that position 1, where you'll have the full 415 millimeters, it is going to limit your card choice even more. But then at the very top, though, you're only going to have space for 2 120mm fans. So if you want to place the power supply cage there and you still want to retain rad space at the top, or if you have some really special use case, like you want 2 360mm rads, my recommendation is go for an SFX or SFXL unit in that side spot. But for most users, the most expedient way, if you're building in this case, is just to mount an ATX unit at the front. This is a longer case and it's designed around that purpose. So if you keep it to about 140 millimeters or less, that will give you the most flexibility. Okay, so I know that's a lot of info regarding compatibility. So here is how I would sum that one up. One, just look at the length of the card you're going to build with or you're thinking of building with. If it's less than 334 millimeters, you're completely good to go with a top 360 and ATX power supply. If that card is greater than 334 millimeters, then you're gonna potentially have issues with a top mounted 360. So what you can do at that point is consider a smaller power supply or just air cool, because you can fit up to 165 millimeters. So something like Deepcool's AK620 would fit without issue. Or if you're planning on running a 240, most likely you're not gonna have a problem either. A rad or fan panel does come pre-mounted, and that's nice, and it gives you options. If you have a front position PSU like here, you can do up to a 280 right here. If you side mount your PSU, then you could do a full 360 and rad and fan combo here. So there's a lot of options to build this case up. At the back, a single 120 is possible, although I actually couldn't put the fan that I wanted here because of the fittings on my radiator. And even though it does physically fit, the slots on the case aren't cut low enough. So, finally, for cooling, you could put 3 120mm fans at the bottom. The case supports mATX boards, as the name would suggest, or mini-itx. 4 expansion slots here, so the thickness of the card, it typically won't be limited by the case. If you choose to mount 25mm fans at the bottom, like I've done, then the official spec is 61mm for the card. And that's an 86mm total number, which sounds slightly conservative from what I've seen here by about 5 to 6mm based on what I've built up with here. But that's a sensible amount of space to leave between the card and the fans to avoid turbulence, so that's likely why they've spec'd it as such. As for the width of the card, I didn't see an official spec, but in terms of the absolute space here, you have about 168mm or so. There's quite a bit of leeway, but it will to some extent depend on your power connector. Like I have it here with 2 8-pin power connectors, I have about 20mm left of width if I just exert a little bit of pressure on it. I could bend it a lot more, but at that point just get an adapter. But based on this being a 118mm card, I'd say that you can safely mount a card about 143mm in width, depending on the type of connector you use, and that is plenty. So you may have a little more. Just figure that these 8-pin connectors here account for about 11mm of space. You have plenty of storage options as well with this case. A drive tray for 2 2.5-inch SSDs comes pre-mounted, and that can move to the front as well. And there is an additional spot for a 2.5-inch SSD or HDD at the bottom. Finally, there's one special feature, and that is a magnetic GPU support bracket. Okay, so this guy attaches where the SSD is, and this sits on top, and that'll support your card if you have a heavier card with this. Completely optional, but it's there if you want to avoid GPU sag. For this build, it's actually pretty much the same build as the 33-liter Asus AP201 that I just reviewed. Got a Gigabyte B650M MATX board here with a Ryzen 7900X, Gigabyte 6800 XT Gaming OC, and this is deliberate because I really want it as close of a comparison as possible. Now, the one change that I've opted for is P28s as case fans at the bottom. So this case is fantastic to build in. The screws and accessories even come in this plastic organizer, so that's such a low cost but high impact, huge quality of life improvement. And in fact, this is one of the few cases that I've ever seen this been done. Really neat. So if you get it, the first thing I would do is go ahead and play around with the power supply cage position, right? Get it installed in there and just figure out exactly where you want to mount it, where your cables are going to go, and mock up and dry fit your radiator or cooler or whatever you're doing here. Just so when you start building, you know exactly how things are going to go together. Here I have the power supply in position 4. I have a 160mm ATX unit in the Cooler Master GX3, and I still have enough clearance at the bottom for cabling, and also the GA2 Trinity Performance here at the top. This is a 60mm thick unit altogether, and I really could not fit any thicker because of where the fan interfaces the board's rear I/O heatsink essentially. I do like this power supply in this position though, because it does make the cables less visible. It kind of pushes things down to where it's recessed here, and just make sure the fan faces in because the front is not a ventilated panel. For front panel I/O, you have 2 USB-A, 1 C, separate mic and headphone, power button, and the front panel cable is a single sleeved connector, which I really like. One important thing is that there's no cable management area at the blind side of the case, so you really do have to be creative where you hide them. Above the motherboard is a little area where the AC power cable can go, and I also snuck my CPU EPS cable there, but there's really nothing else. You kind of have to see where things can't be seen and snake it behind there. There are cable type points though. So I did manage to hide my cables behind the power supply, behind the radiator pretty well, and actually cleans up really nicely despite not having a cable management train. You just cinch everything down. Build order, it's pretty flexible, but I did power supply first, then board, bottom fans, AIO, and the one thing I didn't like as much with this build is the tubing shape, because I had to have this exit here. There wasn't enough room over here. And when you had the fittings exit over the board, it's not really a great way to manage the tubing. Could have turned this another whirl around, but then it would be really, really tight. So okay, like this though. And then after all that, you can slot in the card and screw it down to the bracket. There is a little mini panel there that swivels to close over the slot hangers, and that will just close with the thumb screw. Airflow setup I have here, top radiator is exhausting. Bottom fans are intaking to feed the GPU. One thing is you may want to think about the bottom fans pretty carefully. So sometimes when they are close to the GPU, you can actually inhibit the GPU's intake. And what's happening here is that the center hub of these two fans, it's really close to the center of the GPU's fans. So it's actually not a great setup necessarily here. All right, thermals. I use the same unit, same RPM as I did in the Asus AP201. So the case here does have a glass panel as an option, so we'll test that too. With stock PBO, these two cases with the ventilated panel, they're basically the same. But you know, testing on PBO isn't always the most consistent or the best way, because that can vary one way or another, even if you're using the exact same case. And as you can see, the glass panel actually tested out to be better. But to get an accurate comparison, I did lock the voltage at 1.25 volts, clocking in at 5.4 gigahertz. 7900X is actually a little bit cooler in the A3. What surprised me was how little penalty there was for running the glass panel, because it's really not too bad at all. For combined use on stock PBO, same GPU, fan RPMs at 2400 RPM here. And I did double check to make sure that the board power was the same between all tests, and that was at 264 watts. So while the CPU only test is pretty close, here is where we'll see a bigger difference against the bigger AP201. The GPU comes in about 6 degrees warmer, CPU about 5 degrees warmer, which to me indicates a couple things. One, there's more GPU exhaust getting into the radiator versus the AP201. And two, GPU is not getting as clean an intake as possible. So I did want to explore a few things, exhaust all my options, if you will. And even though the fan could not mount at the back with my setup, I was able to leverage a few of the vent holes and just rig it up. And by doing so, the GPU temps improved slightly, but the CPU temps saw the most benefit. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because instead of going up into the rad to pass through the radiator, some of that GPU exhaust in the hot, ambient case temp, it's getting directed out the back and it bypasses the rad. In addition to testing the rear exhaust, another thing I did was just to take out the bottom fans. What I noticed was that the center hub of the bottom fans was possibly interfering or impeding my GPU cooler's own fans. And despite the intent to feed the card air, you could actually be doing more harm. And testing it without the fans, I actually saw an improvement at the CPU side and also the GPU side. And that proved my theory out. And it just so happens to be that the fans I was using and the GPU cooler, and really more so the GPU cooler, because most 120mm fans will have a center spot right there that is solid. And that just happened to impede my fans there. And if they're not doing anything, all the fans are doing is just actively pushing the GPU's exhaust into the path of the radiator. Without the bottom fans running, the CPU cooler, the radiator, is going to draw more air from the side panel where there isn't as much hot air coming through. And that will lower the CPU temps. So if you are thinking of putting fans there, that's something I would try out first just to see if it even makes sense, because you actually could be doing harm versus good. In general, the thermals are good. They're not necessarily the best, but from what I see, it'll work for even the most power-hungry components today. What I found most interesting is that the use of a solid side panel here doesn't seem to meaningfully change the thermals in both the CPU-only scenario or a combined use scenario. And that really surprised me, because usually there is a bigger penalty for that. And also the tempered glass panel, it does have a measurable impact on the noise levels. Measured 20 centimeters away, the resulting noise was 2.5 decibels less with the glass panel. So for those of you that like to see into your build, I can recommend this case as a good candidate for this purpose. So, go ahead and get the glass panel at the same time. Let's take a quick listen here. The rad fans are at 1430 RPM, just to give you an idea of the case panels and their effect on the sound. Let's talk pros of the case. First off, the case comes in at $70 US, and that's crazy good value, but it's not a cheaply made case at all. It surprised me, because irrespective of the price, I was really impressed by the case. The flexibility, build options, compatibility, this all impressed me, and so did the build quality. The materials here, they're simple, but the fit and finish is very, very good. Things are lined up great, sturdy, no unsightly gaps. And Lian Li usually does a good job with their cases, and this one is no exception. In terms of the material, the only thing that might seem cheaper is the plastic panel at the front, but I think that's acceptable. The location of the front panel I/O, it's great. I like how it's on the bottom. And I like how much they were able to accomplish here with a compact size. The GPU and cooling spec, it's quite similar to the AP201 I just reviewed, yet it's 6 liters smaller. So this doesn't have a cable management tray, but I think it's designed in a way such that the loss of that section is not a big deal. I'd rather take the volume and form factor, smaller form factor savings here. Quality of life things here, like the plastic box, GPU bracket, SFX adapter plate. They didn't have to do these, but they did, and that is huge. There's not too many cons about this case. One minor thing we talked about already, and that is extending the cutout a little bit for the 120mm fan at the back. So I would have preferred to be able to install it because it fit there, but there wasn't a place to do that. I also would have preferred the top rad panel to be mounted with screws, similar to how the A4H2O has a removable tray. That takes rad installation and maintenance to the next level, makes it a little bit easier. Here it's just riveted in. Other than that, I think the case is quite good. It's quite complete. No other complaints about it. This would be an excellent case to someone who is downsizing from a bigger case. For a lot of users, you just need to get an mATX board, and then a lot of your other components will transfer right over, plus whatever you're upgrading. Perhaps you like smaller builds, but you don't like any of the mini-itx boards right now, right? You don't find any of them appealing because either they're too expensive or there's not enough features for you. This would be great because it's kind of like a longer NR200, just a tad taller here. Lots of you will find this a great choice, and for any mATX build, I think you absolutely need to give this a good look. Case will come in white or black. There is a riser cable kit for a vertical GPU that will be $50. Kind of funny because that's like the lion's share of the case's cost. So I'm not sure why you would want to, add the hassle of the vertical GPU, because direct mounting in this case is mostly fine here. And the tempered glass panel, it's $12. So if you get the case plus the glass panel, it's $82 US. And by the way, I do like that it's an option because you don't necessarily want one, so you don't have to pay for it if you don't want one. And if you do, you can get one. It's not cost prohibitive there. So in summary, this is a fantastic case with tons of modularity and modern compatibility. On its own, it is a great case, but it completely exceeded my expectations for a $70 case. This 26-liter case, if the volume is right for you, this for me is a run, don't walk, hurry up and go get one type of goodie. So I hope you enjoyed the review. Links are down below for the components. We'll have links for the case up as well. Please give a like, subscribe. Big thanks for watching.